Welcome to CNI's Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host today, Allison Weir. I'm a board member of CNI and also executive director of This American's New. I have two guests with me today by phone from different parts of the world. One of them is Paul Larudee. He will be joining us from California. The other is Seth Freedman, who I believe will be speaking from London. Paul is, right now, he's a piano technician, a piano tuner. He has quite a strong background in knowledge about the Middle East. But to give some of his personal background, Paul is the son of a Presbyterian minister. He has a PhD in linguistics from Georgetown University. He spent, I believe it was, at least 14 years in the Middle East with various jobs as a Fulbright lecturer. So, Paul, I'm so happy. Are you with us today? Are you on the line?
It's a pleasure to be with you, Allison.
The reason Paul is with us, he was on board one of the ships of the recent Freedom Flotilla to Gaza, trying to take humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. He was on board. He can tell us firsthand what it was like and what actually happened on board his ship, and then also what happened when those participants were taken and imprisoned by Israel. For, I believe, was it 2 days that people were held, Paul?
Not everyone was held for the same amount of time, but generally speaking, most people were held for 2 to 3 days.
Of course, that prevented the press from speaking with almost all of you.
Yes, there was a small number, including Ambassador Ed Peck and Joe Medders, who were part of our U.S. delegation aboard the flotilla, who, as planned, signed whatever was necessary and got out quickly in order to have at least some of the voice of the passengers on board available. And that was helpful, but of course, for the vast majority of us, we had no way of even knowing what was going on in the meantime outside. We were allowed normal means of communication with the outside world. We had no means of communicating with anyone else, for that matter.
Just to clarify for the audience that may not know this, Joe Medders is a decorated U.S. Navy veteran who also survived a previous attack on a ship in international waters when he was on board the USS Liberty, in which Israeli forces killed 34 American servicemen, injured at least 174 of them, and tried to sink the entire ship with everybody aboard. So that's Joe Medders, who's now just been on another ship attacked in international waters. Paul, if you could briefly tell us about what happened with your ship. The media have mainly talked about paintball guns.
Perhaps only 2 of them had the paintball guns. I'm not sure what the purpose of that was, but all of them had automatic weapons. They also had tasers and batons of some kind. They boarded the ship while it was still dark, and we were essentially in the middle of the Mediterranean in international waters, roughly 80 miles from shore. They came aboard in small boats, fast Zodiac inflatables. Our ship was one of the smaller ones, not the large passenger ship that was the Turkish one. Ours was flying the Togo flag and came from Greece. They soon took over the ship. We tried to prevent, through nonviolent resistance, the attack on the wheelhouse, but they broke the glass, tased us, beat us with batons, tear-gassed us, used percussion grenades. Eventually, of course, as expected, they prevailed, tied our hands, and essentially subdued us.
By automatic weapons, were these, small handguns that are automatic, or were they what I would call a machine gun, or what were those?
I'm not an expert in these things, but I assume it was something like an Uzi or something like that. They are rifle-type guns with clips that can provide automatic fire. That much I could tell.
Far cry from paintball guns.
Oh, yes. I mean, they also had the paintball guns, but they didn't come just with that.
Yeah. And how many of them would you estimate boarded?
Well, I would have to say between 10 and 20. I didn't necessarily see all of them at the same time, but I saw them boarding. There were at least 10 on the boat that I saw unloading.
So then I know that they took the ship to Israel forcibly, and then they did not release people. In
my case, I was hoping for more nonviolent resistance by the passengers of the ship, but I have to say many of them were not trained in nonviolent resistance beyond what the few hours that we could give them in techniques. So I decided to do my own form of nonviolent resistance, which was to jump ship into the sea, which actually succeeded in tying up 2 ships for more than an hour. And so I was not on board that ship for the rest of the journey into the port of Ashdod. When I got there, I was beaten very soundly, ended up with a black eye before I even got to the port. Almost went into shock from some of the treatment, and told them that I was going into shock and that I needed some covering against the wind and the cold.
Just to interrupt a second, in my introduction, I forgot to mention that you're 64 years old. Is that correct?
That's correct. So then when I got to shore, I refused to cooperate with any of the procedures or to even talk or walk. They tried to coerce me into walking by stressing my joints, basically twisting my arms and legs and hands and neck in some cases. And eventually during the procedure, I don't want to describe it all, it's quite long, they ended up smashing my head against the concrete floor, kicking me in the head. They smashed me in the jaw. One of them hit me in the jaw a couple of times. I have not pushed or hit anyone in more than 20 years, so that was not the kind of resistance that I did.
Now, did that happen both on board ship and then in Israeli custody?
Initially, it happened as soon as they pulled me out of the water, and then most of it happened actually later in Israeli custody when they were trying to get me to comply with what they wanted. Obviously, we know that 9 people died on another ship, which was far worse than what I suffered, and other people were wounded, some of them probably with permanent injuries. When Israeli forces kill 9 unarmed civilians and wound a couple dozen, that really is what you might call an average day in Palestine, because this is something that Palestinians live with on a daily basis and have done so for up to 62 years.
They used this kind of violence against you when you were in custody. It wasn't part of some sort of melee, et cetera,
they don't know
where
how to do anything
there was some
difficulty
and this was by accident. This happened while you were in custody, and you yourself were using no violence, and there was no other violence by other people around you. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. Some people rose to my defense and didn't use the same techniques as I did and ended up suffering greatly with broken bones and so forth, but I did not myself.
Now, I understand you were taken to the hospital at some point?
That was a ridiculous thing, because the wounds that I suffered are not something that are going to show up easily on X-ray or that needed any particular kind of treatment. It was very painful, but they know how to apply pain in a way that it either doesn't show or heals fairly rapidly.
Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host today, Alison Weir. I have 2 guests with me, Dr. Paul Larudee, who was on board the Freedom Flotilla and has just described his beatings by Israeli forces. Also later in the show with me will be Seth Freedman, a very pro-Israel journalist who writes mostly in the UK Guardian. We'll just get back to Paul. So, Paul, you feel that you were not taken to the hospital of medical necessity?
Exactly. They didn't quite know what to do with me when I collapsed on the dock and forced them to carry me around to the various stations. There appeared to be news media around, cameras and so forth. The pain that they were causing me caused me to scream, and it generally was a bit disruptive. They ended up putting me on a stretcher and carrying me around, but that also, with me strapped to a stretcher, was not a good image. And so they very quickly put me in an ambulance, which was a good place to hide me. Well, if you put somebody in an ambulance, you need an excuse. And so they took me to the hospital for an examination, which I refused. Because I wanted to get back with the rest of them as soon as possible, I didn't want them to just hide me away somewhere.
This was part of this effort, much of it successful, to control the image of the attack and really to control media coverage of it.
Exactly. I ended up in a prison that was quite far away from all the rest of the prisoners, along with the captain of the ship that I was on, the Svendoni. Both of us had very visible injuries, and I think that's the reason that we were separated, because we were not the image that Israel wanted to show. So we were basically hidden away.
I have seen those pictures. I saw the bruises. It looked like all over your arms and body.
Yeah, that's quite accurate. I didn't show very much the legs, but that's also where they beat me.
This is a good point. to talk with Seth Freedman, who is one of the journalists who wrote about this early on. I'll read Seth Freedman's bio from his agency. Journalist and writer Seth Freedman is a regular contributor to The Guardian. Originally from North London, Seth went straight from school to become a city broker. He was a stockbroker for 6 successful years until, they say, he swapped Armani for the army when he enlisted in the Israeli Defense Force. Giving up his high-living, hedonistic lifestyle, Seth became a soldier in the Israeli military in November of 2004. It says that he left in 2006, having kept diaries throughout his service, and has published a book on that called Can I Bring My Own Gun? Seth, are you still in the Israeli military?
I'm not a reservist in the Israeli army. If, God forbid, there was some kind of existential war and they needed to call me up, I am available, but I don't do regular annual reserve duty.
Sorry, that's still a little confusing to me. You say that they can call you up.
They could do because I'm a fully trained combat soldier, but I certainly don't go through the process every year like most reservists who spend time in the West Bank or within Israel actually patrolling the borders and carrying out missions. So no, I'm not a reservist in that sense.
Do they have a title for what you are?
No, not at all. Just someone that has formally served and has performed a tour of duty.
And should they call you up, what rank would you hold?
I imagine what I held when I left, which is some form of sergeant. I'm not sure it directly translates, but someone who's gone through the tour, so certainly not at corporal level.
And you are, I assume, an Israeli citizen?
Yeah, I'm a fully fledged citizen. I moved here 6 years ago and got citizenship within a year of moving here.
So you were originally a British citizen who moved to Israel and became an Israeli citizen?
Correct, and I'm a dual national. I live in Tel Aviv, but I spend quite a lot of time in London as well.
I've looked back through your record a bit, and it looks like you write about Israel fairly often. In these articles, do you disclose that you are an Israeli citizen and that you have served in the Israeli military?
Certainly, to the extent that The Guardian provides a short biography of what I do. It says that I was a combat soldier. It details the fact that I was born in London but moved here and became a citizen. So, I mean, it's freely available to anyone who reads my work.
When they read the specific article, is it visible right there? If I just suddenly read your article on The Guardian, would I see that?
Sometimes I refer to the fact that a certain event is something that I'd seen a similar occurrence happen during my service, but it's certainly not disclosed every time. But that's more for The Guardian to decide how they frame each individual author. I think it's fair to assume that every male Israeli who's writing for a newspaper, whether domestically or abroad, has served in the Israeli military, and most of the women as well.
The problem is, as you're probably aware, I'm calling you from the United States, where much of this information is really unknown, the degree to which that exists. So it's good to clarify that for our listeners.
Sure.
One of the questions that I had about the article that you wrote recently, which has precipitated inviting you to be with us today, you had an article that came out, I believe it was June 1st.
Yeah.
So that was quite early on in the coverage of the attack on the flotilla, in which you said the title is, quote, Israel had no choice over Gaza flotilla. And you make a number of statements in there that I think have since proved, as more information has been able to come out, to be considerably inaccurate. You allege that they had planned to attack violently the commandos, that the aid people on board the ships were armed, that they were the aggressors in the attack. Since you wrote that, there have been a number of reports that Israeli forces were firing even before the commandos landed. In light of what has come out since you wrote your article, do you feel that there were errors in your article that you need now to correct?
I would actually argue the opposite to what you're saying. You've claimed that Israeli soldiers were, or at least reports have claimed Israeli soldiers were firing before they boarded the ship. If that were the case, and we knew this from the beginning that it wasn't the case, none of the videos that you saw showing activists on board the flotilla actually attacking soldiers with iron rods and clubs and knives, none of them would have been on board. They'd have been running for cover. They'd have been hiding from the bullets that were supposedly being fired. I've been in combat situations. If bullets are being fired, no one is standing. No one's just walking around as though nothing's going on. And it's quite clear that soldiers rappelling down the ropes from the helicopters were set upon immediately. Had there been shots fired, you wouldn't have been able to get your hands on one commando, let alone 5 or 6 who were beaten by the mob.
That actually has not been my experience. When I was in the West Bank at some of these nonviolent demonstrations where Israeli forces attack with all sorts of weaponry, many people flee, but many people also continue to use nonviolent resistance. I think Paul Larudee, who is on the phone with us, at one point, as I recall, had shrapnel in his legs because he was one of the ones that did not flee. So I think there are a variety of responses to that kind of thing.
I'm sure there are a variety of responses, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone, whether a military expert or just someone like yourself or like me who's been in these situations both as an observer or participant, who thinks that there's an entire deck full of people. Out of all of them, no one would be running for cover in the videos, and there's not one even second of newsreel that shows anyone running for cover when they're first rappelling down the ropes. The commandos' absolute priority is for their own lives and their comrades' lives, and they would certainly.
If I could interrupt just a minute, there's a really excellent story just came out about a day or two ago by 2 journalists, Nora Burroughs-Friedman and Abraham Greenhouse. The title of their article is "Independent Journalists Dismantling Israel's Hold on Media Narrative." They have a number of facts in that. For example, that the video on which I assume you were basing much of your study was clearly highly edited by the Israeli military, something that I believe Israel has since admitted. A number of the claims initially made by Israel have since been retracted or are no longer on the various websites where they were being made. The fact that Israel controlled the story, that eyewitnesses were prevented from speaking to the media, and that Israeli forces confiscated all of the cameras, the videotape, this leads to a questionable effort to allow people to really know the facts. Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm still your host today, Alison Weir, and with me is Mr. Seth Freedman, UK Guardian journalist and former Israeli soldier, and Paul Larudee, who was on board one of the boats on board the Freedom Flotilla. I wanted to ask Seth about the fact that Israeli forces prevented people from speaking to the press, that they confiscated cameras, that they then edited the footage that they got from journalists' cameras and used that in a very edited fashion. This has been denounced by a number of journalist professional organizations, even by Israel's Foreign Press Association, which stated on June 4th, quote, "The use of this material without permission from the relevant media organizations is a clear violation of journalistic ethics and unacceptable," unquote. A number of organizations have condemned Israel from attacking journalists, of taking their... By the way, a number of the possessions taken by these hundreds of journalists and aid participants is still being kept. There are reports that some credit cards are being used in Israel, for example, in Tel Aviv. So as a journalist, Seth, what do you feel about the Israeli military's treatment of journalists?
I believe that any flagrant violation of journalistic ethics and allowing freedom of the press should definitely be condemned by all sides, regardless of political affiliation. And so certainly if there are instances where footage has been doctored and so on, of course I condemn it like anyone else should, whether in the profession or outside. You wouldn't expect me to say anything differently.
No, that's right.
One thing that I don't think you've made clear, and it's not necessarily your job to, but I will say on my behalf, is I've written over 300 articles for The Guardian about Israel-Palestine. I'm what you would term anti-Israel. I don't apply that label to myself, but I am almost unequivocally critical of the Israeli government in almost every one of my articles. I certainly don't think that the siege on Gaza is something that's acceptable. I certainly don't think the policy towards the Palestinians in the West Bank is acceptable. This is an isolated affair. You've got someone on the line, Dr. Larudee, who you didn't challenge him when he said that there were unarmed civilians being killed. Everyone knows that the activists who attacked the soldiers were armed, and you had the opportunity to challenge him and say, well, clearly they were armed. I mean, even the activists themselves say...
Seth, let me just ask a question. So you are alleging that the people that were killed were armed?
I cannot tell you the individuals who were killed. What I am saying is that there was a pitched battle on the Marmara ship, and that is something
who brought the lethal weapons on board? Who brought the guns?
Both sides brought lethal weapons on board. A lethal weapon is an iron rod and a club, a lethal weapon is a machine gun, and 100% the commandos had guns. In any army in the world, if they were rappelling onto a boat in order to stop it sailing into waters where it didn't want it to go, would be bringing weapons. I mean, I'm not saying that I support what Israel did in terms of stopping the ship, but certainly you would expect commandos of any army under any flag would be bringing weapons. On 5 of the ships, no one offered violent resistance and no one was killed. On the 6th ship, where they premeditatedly planned to attack the soldiers, and that enough documentation exists that it doesn't matter.
These are very serious accusations, and as you know, especially as journalists, we feel that we should have some evidence or some sort of citation for our accusations. So,
certainly, there is.
First of all, let me just ask you a few questions. What is your evidence that this was a premeditated assault by the aid act? Now, I can see the evidence that it was a premeditated assault by the Israeli Navy that had followed these aid ships with naval ships and had commandos board them with automatic weapons. So clearly that was premeditated. Most people viewing even the edited versions that we've seen, see that a situation where someone is invaded by armed forces and some of the people defended themselves with materials at hand. That's certainly the way it appears. But you're saying that this was a premeditated defense? And I wonder what your evidence is.
First of all, we've got the captain's testimony, the captain of the ship, who said that explicitly that this was a premeditated attack. He knew that violence was being planned aboard his ship. He tried to stop it. He tried to throw some of the weaponry overboard before the Israelis boarded the ship. And at that point, he was told by activists, no, we're going to fight on. That's his testimony, and I'm just reporting back to you what he said. It's available to anyone who wants to delve into it. Secondly, we've got activists. There's videos, footage of them preparing the weapons, standing around the boat with clubs in hand, with knives ready for the soldiers boarding. That's the premeditation. Whether you think Israel is right or wrong to board the ship is beside the point. That is premeditation.
The idea of people standing around with knives in hand, if you're referring to the photograph that was later...
I'm not referring to photographs, I'm referring to video footage. I've got the video footage here. Obviously, on a radio interview, I can say that I've got the footage. You can say it doesn't exist. I can send it to you. I mean, no one really argues about the fact that these people planned it in advance. Really what it boils down to is if you think Israel were wrong to board the ship, that's your opinion and you're welcome to stand by it. But there can be no argument that there were a whole corps of activists on that ship who planned to attack the soldiers as soon as they were boarded. And that is what transpired. And tragically, 9 people were killed as a result.
I think there have been quite a few people arguing with quite a bit of evidence against that version of it. Maybe this is a chance to let Paul Larudee give some of his information. And do you have a response, Paul?
I was not on board the Mavi Marmara. However, I did not see any of our group, nor did I hear of any plans from any of our group to seek out Israelis and to attack them. We tried to prepare for the eventuality that Israeli soldiers would come and attack us, and that's exactly what happened. From what I could see on my own ship, and from what I could see from the edited video that was released, these were people who had not taken any weapons on board, but picked up what was available on hand to try to defend themselves, as some of them were being attacked by Israeli soldiers. That's what I could see.
Mrs. Ware?
Yes, and certainly on the, I know at least one photo that was considered quite significant. Haaretz finally did remove the photo, but never actually retracted what had been done to make people aware that a photo was being used incorrectly. Some of the so-called evidence for violence has since been disputed, showing that photographs have light in them, showing that they were taken during the day, even though the assault happened during the night hours. So a lot of this is called into question by Nora Burroughs-Friedman and by Abe Greenhouse. I recommend people read their article and can consider it for themselves. There's one other announcement that I wanted to give before I forget to do that. The Council for the National Interest President, Jean Bird, has announced that CNI received messages from Beirut regarding a Lebanese boat that's going to try to take aid to Gaza, that's planning to leave probably about June 25th to help break the siege of Gaza that has, as Seth Freedman has acknowledged, really caused catastrophic conditions for Gazan civilians, where 99% of fishermen can't earn a living anymore, or deeply poverty-stricken, in which 1/3 of Gaza's agricultural land now is a wasteland because of Israeli incursions, where a very high percentage of Gaza businesses are closed down because of this blockade. So we have another boat that's leaving from Lebanon. Many of the participants will be women. This was reported by AFP today. And Jean Bird is inviting CNI members to join it. A previous CNI member, Ambassador Ed Peck, was on board the flotilla that was attacked. He was on the radio show with us not too long ago. So the invitation is for other people in CNI and others to join CNI in joining the boat from Lebanon. You can contact CNI to get information about how to do that by emailing the organization Council for the National Interest. There's already been a strong response from people interested in joining this, so please contact CNI if you'd be interested in doing that type of thing. Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm Allison Weir, and with me today are Paul Larudee, a California piano tuner and participant on board the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza, and Seth Freedman, UK and Israeli journalist who was a former Israeli soldier. I just wanted to ask Paul Larudee, we're hearing that 9 people were killed, but there have been suggestions that some people are still missing and there could be more. Do you know anything about that?
I've heard the same report, but I can't verify any more of that than you can. I don't have any sources of information that you don't.
Do you have any numbers about how many people were injured by the Israeli commandos?
What I've heard is several dozen, and some of them quite seriously. I really can't add very much to that.
Okay, thanks. Then we'll quickly take a question from Carl in Queens. Carl?
Yeah, I have a question for Seth. With all due respect, Seth, do you really expect anyone to believe that the flotilla members would be so stupid as to challenge Israeli soldiers who kill people at the drop of a hat with sticks and clubs? Don't the scorecard alone tell you 9-0 who's at fault, who the murderers are, and who the victims are?
Seth, did you want to respond to that?
All I heard up to was, do I think that they'd be so stupid as to attack Israeli soldiers? I don't know further what he said, so I couldn't hear him properly. So if you could clarify that.
Many people, if you're attacked, sort of fight back, but that it's hard to think that it was premeditated, and the fact that 9 people from the flotilla were killed and no Israeli soldiers were killed, the caller shows the one-sided lethal violence.
The caller in question might well think that stabbing a soldier and tossing one soldier off the side of the boat and laying into another one with clubs is something that's perfectly acceptable. If he does, then with respect, he's entitled to his opinion. I think that that's an attack on soldiers trying to kill them. I think the soldiers definitely tried to kill those who attack them. And I'm not sure further what you want me to say. We know that militants do attack soldiers around the world, even knowing that they're likely, if not to lose their lives, certainly to be seriously injured. Do I agree with that strategy? Not at all. Do I accept that it goes on in the name of one political cause or another? Definitely. I'm not sure why this should be any different.
But what do you think about this maneuver of dropping these armed commandos on board these ships? Do you think this was a smart move by Israel? Is this something you would have ordered if you had been in the position to do that, or do you think there was any error?
I think you would be hard-pressed to find any country in the world that was enforcing a blockade, whether navally or in any other way, that if a ship was trying to breach the terms of that blockade, would not step in and try to commandeer that ship. I'm not saying I agree with the policy of the blockade, but certainly if America saw a boat sailing into its waters, or even international waters around it, but that had promised that it was heading there, they would definitely intercept it. And Israel offered...
Just to interrupt, one of the problematical things about this particular blockade, if we want to give it that term, it's certainly a hermetic closure, is that this is blocking, by Israel's own admission, this is blocking food, medicines, building supplies from getting in. That's well documented, and trying to prevent people from bringing those types of things in, especially these ships had been, I'm sure you're aware, or maybe you're not, they had been searched before they left their ports, showing that they were not carrying weapons. The weapons that are being alleged were used are the types of things I have in my own home here. I have kitchen knives here. I have different types of bars. So the idea of a blockade is not exactly what's been going on against Gaza, as I suspect.
Okay, but Mrs. Weir, I've said to you 2, if not 3 times explicitly just during this program that I do not agree with the blockade. I don't know what more you want me to say. Israel does enforce the blockade.
Okay, and thank you. We can hopefully get back to that, but let me take our next caller, Preston from Crawford.
Yeah, it's concerning. I'm seeing a narrative take place here. Okay, now this flotilla was seized in international waters. The IDF landed people on these ships to seize these ships. So, as Seth is kind of alluding to, that these people, he says, premeditated, went into this knowing that they were going to attack soldiers if they were seized or whatever. But using this kind of logic here, I mean, I could see where Israel could invade Lebanon, and anybody in Lebanon who resisted, Israel could then say, well, look, they premeditatedly armed themselves to whatever. I mean, I know it's a stretch, but I mean, is there any defense against Israel that can't be used or worked in the press are they never not attacked?
Thank you, Preston. Seth, would you like to respond?
Could I just ask you something quickly? When your guest, Dr. Larudee, said that killing 9 unarmed civilians is just the same as an average day in Palestine, I hope you disagree with that. I'm amazed that you didn't challenge that as a statement, because you've challenged pretty much everything I've said. An average day in Palestine is not killing 9 unarmed civilians for all the horrors of the occupation and what goes on there. Do you agree that that is an average day, or do you think that that's a statement that should have been challenged?
I would say fewer than that are killed in an average day. On an average day in Palestine, there are about 10 or 11 armed raids into Palestine.
I wasn't saying whether there are armed raids. I'm asking whether you think that
Seth, what I would characterize...
Do you think that that's an acceptable statement, 9 unarmed civilians are killed every day in Palestine? Because it isn't the case. I mean, even the Palestinians don't claim that. But you had the opportunity to challenge it and say... Like you've challenged me throughout the program, and you're entitled to.
You're giving me an opportunity to clarify what an average day is, which I think is valuable. Thanks for that. On an average day, Israeli forces, armed Israeli forces, invade what is internationally recognized as Palestinian territory approximately 10 to 11 times a day. They take usually about a dozen Palestinians, most of them, sometimes all of them civilians, captive on an average day. On an average day, Israeli settlers attack Palestinians in numerous types of ways. So this is what the average day is like.
I
you're quite correct.
That was something worth
you're
challenging.
Quite correct that they don't
you didn't
on
think
an average
it was worth
day.
Challenging. Okay, fine. So when Dr. Larudee makes these statements, and he's completely within his rights to use hyperbole in order to bolster his case, it's difficult for me to respond civilly to the idea that someone who wasn't on the Marmara ship, who didn't see what went on, can come up with conjecture about what might have taken place there. It's no more valid than my opinion sitting near the beach in Tel Aviv. I don't come out with spurious statements that claim that dozens of Israeli civilians are killed left, right and centre by Palestinian militants, and likewise that should have been challenged.
Seth, actually, you've come out with quite a few statements that could have been challenged, and I've only had a chance to challenge a few of them, because I do try to give you time and Paul time to speak as well. I do try to give you time and Paul time to speak as well. I do try to give you time and Paul